In 1941, Sir Paul Latham, a wealthy conservative MP and Royal Artillery officer, deliberately crashed his motorcycle into a tree in a calculated suicide attempt. He was trying to escape a criminal scandal that threatened to collapse the British government's wartime credibility. This is Winston Churchill's dirtiest secret revealed, the factual account of the degenerate officer history erased. Latham weaponized his military rank to exploit lower-ranking soldiers in an illicit network, forcing the British establishment to orchestrate an unprecedented classified cover-up to protect their own power. To comprehend the magnitude of the scandal that would eventually destroy him, one must first examine the foundation upon which his power was built. Born in 1905, Latham was a product of immense wealth and untouchable privilege. He inherited the title of baronet and an expansive fortune that included the magnificent Hurstmonceux Castle in East Sussex, a sprawling estate that symbolized the deep-rooted power of the English aristocracy. In the rigid, uncompromising class hierarchy of early 20th century Britain, a man like Latham was entirely insulated from the struggles of everyday life. He seamlessly entered politics, securing the seat of Scarborough and Whitby for the Conservative Party. He walked the corridors of Westminster, rubbing shoulders with the men who dictated the fate of the empire. When World War II broke out, the British ruling class was expected to lead by example. Latham joined the Royal Artillery, securing a position as a commanding officer. The military at this time was the absolute backbone of national survival. Its officers were presented to the public as paragons of virtue, discipline, and moral authority. They were the men entrusted with the lives of thousands of young Britons. Any deviation from this standard was not just viewed as a personal failing. It was treated as a direct attack on the morale of the nation and the credibility of the government, self. To complete his bulletproof public persona, Latham secured a highly advantageous aristocratic marriage. It was the perfect political and social alliance. It provided him with a flawless shield that deflected any potential scrutiny of his private life. Behind this carefully constructed shield, however, Latham operated in a completely different reality. Beneath the veneer of the respectable married conservative MP, he was drawn to a dangerous and highly illegal underground lifestyle. He was heavily involved in the pursuit of working-class men for sexual encounters. In civilian life, this was a massive risk. Homosexuality was strictly illegal in Britain, carrying severe prison sentences, hard labor, and total social ruin. But Latham took his predilections directly into the military environment. He used his wealth and, critically, his rank as an officer to proposition and exploit enlisted men, targeting gunners, privates, and local working-class civilians who lived near the military camps. This behavior crossed a profoundly dangerous line. It was not merely a matter of illegal sexuality in the eyes of the law. It was a fundamental subversion of military discipline. An officer soliciting sex from the men he was supposed to command obliterated the strict hierarchy that the British Army relied upon to function. The power dynamic was completely skewed. The lower-ranking men he pursued had almost no ability to refuse a commanding officer, making the encounters inherently exploitative. A private could not easily reject the advances of a baronet without fearing professional retaliation, court-martial on fabricated charges, or transfer to the front lines. Latham was leveraging the authority of the British military to serve his own private desires, creating a volatile situation that was bound to explode. The inevitable collapse came in the summer of 1941. Latham's reckless behavior finally caught up with him when military police or local authorities intercepted his activity. S. He was caught in the act, engaged with 3 men, including both military personnel under his command and local civilians. The arrest sent an immediate paralyzing shockwave through the upper levels of the British government. The timing could not have been worse. The war effort was demanding immense sacrifices from the British public. Rationing was in full effect. Families were losing sons in North Africa and the Atlantic, and the government was constantly demanding unity and fortitude. If the press got hold of a story detailing a wealthy conservative MP and military officer exploiting working-class soldiers for sex, the public backlash would be catastrophic. It threatened to demoralize the troops who were already enduring horrific conditions, humiliate the Conservative Party at a time when Winston Churchill's coalition needed absolute stability, and provide free, devastating propaganda to the Axis powers. Germany's propaganda machine would have a field day broadcasting the moral decay of the British High Command. Latham instantly understood the gravity of the situation. He knew the protocol. Under normal circumstances, a civilian court would try him. The press galleries at the Old Bailey would be packed. The lurid details would be published on the front page of every national newspaper, and the resulting scandal would destroy his family's name forever. Driven by panic and the absolute certainty of his impending social annihilation, Latham made his brutal decision. He secured the motorcycle and embarked on that fatal ride. The impact was meant to be the end of the story, allowing him to die as a tragic casualty of war. But surviving the crash left the British establishment with a massive breathing problem. The government and the military command moved quickly and quietly to contain the blast radius. They simply could not allow Latham to face a standard civilian trial. The risk of media exposure was far too great. Instead, they orchestrated a highly unusual, legal, dubious maneuver. Even though Latham's offenses deeply involved civilians, the authorities decided to rip jurisdiction away from the civil courts and keep the entire matter strictly within the military justice system. They convened a secret court-martial. This was an unprecedented event. Sir Paul Latham became the first sitting member of Parliament to be court-martialed since 1815. The trial was held in absolute secrecy, conducted while Latham was still physically broken and recovering from his amputations. By keeping the trial behind closed military doors, the establishment achieved 2 vital goals. First, they bypassed the civilian press entirely. The wartime censorship apparatus, an incredibly powerful tool designed to suppress information that could harm national security, was deployed at maximum strength to protect a politician. Newspaper editors were given strict, undeniable directives. There were to be no investigations into the nature of Latham's motorcycle accident, and absolutely zero reporting on the specifics of the court-martial. The details of his exploitation of lower-ranking soldiers were locked away in classified files stamped secret and buried in the archives. Second, the military trial allowed the system to deal with the lower-ranking victims quietly. The privates, gunners, and civilians involved in the scandal were aggressively silenced. There was no public testimony. They were denied the chance to speak in an open court. The military structure easily intimidated the working-class men into submission, transferring them to different units, threatening them with charges of their own, or bearing their involvement to ensure the story never leaked beyond the barracks. Their exploitation was erased from the narrative entirely to protect the broader reputation of the armed forces and the dignity of the officer class. Latham was found guilty. He was stripped of his military rank and discharged with ignominy. He was forced to resign his seat in the House of Commons, and he was sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment. He served his time quietly, hidden away from the public eye that he had courted for so long. The Latham case remains a stark, chilling example of the British class system in action, raising significant historical debates about the nature of justice during wartime. If a standard enlisted man had been caught engaging in homosexual acts, he would have faced public ruin, a brutal civilian trial, and a harsh prison sentence, entirely unprotected by the state. His name would have been dragged through the local papers. Latham, however, was afforded the dark privilege of a secret trial. The establishment did not protect Latham out of loyalty or compassion for a wounded man. They protected him because his public exposure would have damaged the institutions they controlled. They closed ranks to protect their own collective image, discarding the man into the shadows the very moment he became a liability. The erasure of the lower-ranking soldiers highlights a deeply uncomfortable reality of military history. The massive power imbalance meant these men were structurally vulnerable to predators within their own ranks. Their voices and experiences were deemed entirely expendable by a system that prioritized the spotless reputation of the officer class above the safety and justice of the men fighting the war. Sir Paul Latham was eventually released from prison, but his life as a public figure was permanently over. Divorced by his wife to distance her family from the quiet disgrace and completely ostracized by the political and social circles he once dominated, he retreated into complete obscurity. He lived out his remaining years in the shadows until his death in 1955 at the age of 50. His story is not one of wartime heroism or noble sacrifice. It is a harsh reflection of a society that valued appearances over truth, and a stark reminder that the justice system is rarely blind when the reputation of an empire is on the line. The architecture of Sir Paul Latham's public life was meticulously designed to project absolute stability and unquestionable authority. The Latham baronetcy was a relatively recent creation, firmly rooted in the immense industrial wealth generated by his father, Sir Thomas Paul Latham. Born in April 1905, Paul was the sole male heir to this fortune, destined from birth to transition the family's economic power into entrenched political and social dominance. His trajectory was charted through the most exclusive institutions in the British Empire. He was educated at Eton College and subsequently at Magdalen College, Oxford. These were not merely academic institutions. They were the primary incubators for the British ruling class. At Eton and Oxford, Latham was trained in the unwritten codes of the aristocracy, how to command, how to conform, and crucially how to conceal anything that deviated from the strict moral expectations of the establishment. By the late 1920s, Latham began his deliberate ascent into the political arena. He served on the London County Council representing Lewisham East for the conservative-backed Municipal Reform Party. His ambition, backed by vast financial resources, quickly pushed him toward national politics. In 1931, the sitting Member of Parliament for Scarborough and Whitby resigned, opening a pathway to the House of Commons. Latham was selected as the Conservative candidate for the resulting by-election. He won the seat, securing a decisive mandate that officially cemented his status as a national political figure. At 26 years old, he had successfully integrated himself into the core legislative body of the empire. The same year, his father died, and he officially succeeded to the title, becoming the second baronet. He now held the wealth, the title, and the political power required to operate at the highest levels of British society. However, political office and an inherited title were not sufficient to fully secure his position within the elite circles of the 1930s. He needed tangible, monumental evidence of his family's permanence. In 1932, Sir Paul Latham made a purchase that definitively signaled his arrival into the upper echelons of the landed gentry. He bought Hurstmonceux Castle in Sussex, a sprawling historic estate that had fallen into a state of picturesque ruin. He did not merely acquire the property, he poured enormous sums of money into its comprehensive restoration. He modernized the infrastructure, installing electricity and modern conveniences, while meticulously maintaining the period aesthetic of its grand interiors. Hurstmonceux Castle became the physical manifestation of Latham's public identity, grand, imposing, and entirely traditional. To complete the fortification of his public image, Latham required a socially advantageous marriage. The societal expectation for a man of his standing was rigid. He had to marry into an established aristocratic bloodline to legitimize his relatively new baronetcy and produce an heir. In 1933, he fulfilled this requirement by marrying Lady Patricia Doreen More. She was the daughter of Henry More, the 10th Earl of Drogheda, and Kathleen Pelham Byrne. The union connected Latham to a deeply entrenched aristocratic network, providing him with a flawless domestic facade. With a wife from an earldom, a restored castle in Sussex, and a secure seat in the House of Commons, Latham had successfully built an impenetrable fortress around his public life. He was the very model of the interwar conservative politician, projecting an image of moral rectitude and traditional family values. Yet this carefully constructed reality required constant, exhausting maintenance. The British establishment of the 1930s was utterly unforgiving of any deviation from its moral codes. The law, specifically the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, made any homosexual act between men illegal, regardless of consent or privacy. The penalties were severe, including imprisonment with hard labor, but beyond the legal threat, the social consequences of exposure were total annihilation. For a man of Latham's class, discovery meant permanent exile from the House of Commons, the loss of his social standing, and the deep humiliation of his family. Therefore, Latham was forced to compartmentalize his existence. He lived a dangerous double life. The psychological toll of maintaining this extreme dichotomy, the respectable married conservative MP at Hurstmonceux Castle, and the man who actively sought out illicit encounters in the shadows, was immense. He was navigating a society that actively hunted men like him, relying entirely on his wealth and his title to serve as a barrier against the law. He understood that his position afforded him a dangerous level of access and protection, but he also knew that the establishment he served would immediately turn on him if the facade cracked. This fragile equilibrium was tested in 1939 with the outbreak of the Second World War. As a sitting member of Parliament, Latham was legally exempt from military service. He could have remained in Westminster, carrying out his political duties safely removed from the physical dangers of the conflict. However, the political optics of the era demanded visible patriotism from its leaders. The aristocracy was expected to demonstrate its commitment to the war effort through direct military service. Choosing to leverage his exemption would have been viewed as a failure of duty. Consequently, Latham volunteered for the army. He joined the Royal Artillery, eventually serving as an officer with the 71st Searchlight Regiment stationed in Sussex. By placing himself directly within the military hierarchy, Latham fundamentally altered the dynamics of his secret life. He was no longer just a wealthy civilian taking risks in the shadows of London. He was an officer holding the King's commission, bound by military law and strict disciplinary codes. He was placed in direct command of enlisted men, establishing a steep power differential. The military environment of wartime Britain brought thousands of men from different social classes into close proximity, creating new opportunities for Latham, but simultaneously multiplying the risks exponentially. He was now operating his underground network not just against civil law, but directly against the structural integrity of the British armed forces during a national crisis. The collision between his meticulously crafted public shield and his hidden reality was no longer a possibility. It had become an inevitability. The transition from the polished floors of Westminster to the muddy, chaotic encampments of the British military completely rewired the operational mechanics of Paul Latham's secret life. In civilian circles, the pursuit of rough trade was a matter of discreet urban navigation. It involved knowing the right pubs in working-class districts, understanding the subtle codes of eye contact on darkened London streets, and using cash to secure temporary silence. It was dangerous, but the boundaries were clear. Wealth purchasing compliance from poverty. The military environment in Sussex during the early years of the Second World War fundamentally altered this equation. Latham was no longer merely a wealthy civilian. He was an officer holding the King's commission. When he stepped onto the grounds of the 71st Searchlight Regiment, he brought the full crushing weight of the British class system directly into the chain of command. The men under him were not anonymous faces on a city street. They were gunners and privates, young men conscripted from factories, farms, and slums across the country, thrust into a rigid hierarchy where unquestioning obedience was the primary law of survival. The power dynamic in this setting was entirely asymmetrical. The British Army relied on absolute discipline to function. An officer's word was law. Disobedience or even a hint of insubordination from an enemy listed man could result in severe punishment, ranging from hard labor in a military prison to being transferred to the most dangerous, casualty-heavy fronts of the war. For a working-class private, an officer was a figure of absolute authority who controlled his daily existence, his rations, his leave, and ultimately his physical safety. When Latham began to direct his illicit desires toward these men, he weaponized this military authority. He systematically abused the structure that was designed to defend the nation. He recognized that the young, often frightened, and economically deprived men under his command were highly vulnerable. They were separated from their families, subjected to the harsh realities of military discipline, and paid a mere pittance for their service. Latham used his immense personal wealth and his officer's rank to manipulate this vulnerability. The encounters were not interactions of equals. When a commanding officer propositioned a private, the concept of consent was obliterated. A young gunner could not simply refuse a man who held his military fate in his hands without fearing immense retaliation. The threat did not need to be spoken. It was woven into the very fabric of the uniform Latham wore. Furthermore, the financial disparity was staggering. Latham could offer these men food, alcohol, and cash that vastly exceeded their military pay. For some of the enlisted men, compliance was a calculated survival strategy, or a way to secure minor comforts in an otherwise brutal environment. For others, it was sheer coercion, driven by the terror of what a baronet and a commanding officer could do to their military records if they resisted. The physical environment of wartime Britain provided an unprecedented cover for these activities. The enforcement of the blackout plunged the entire country into total darkness every night. Cities, towns, and military camps became shadowy labyrinths designed to hide from German bombers, but they also created perfect concealment for illicit behavior. The rigid schedules of military life meant that Latham knew exactly where his men were, when they were on duty and when they were isolated. He could manipulate rosters, assign specific guards to specific posts, and arrange private meetings under the guise of military business or officer inspections. He operated his network right under the noses of the military establishment, protected by the deeply ingrained assumption that a man of his class and rank was beyond reproach. The British officer class was heavily invested in the myth of its own moral superiority. The idea that a conservative member of parliament and a baronet would actively subvert military discipline by exploiting his own men for sexual gratification was literally unthinkable to the higher command. This collective blind spot gave Latham a terrifying level of operational freedom. He grew increasingly complacent, believing that his aristocratic shield was entirely impenetrable, even within the confines of a military camp. However, the military is an institution built on surveillance, routine, and gossip. While the higher-ranking officers might have been blinded by class solidarity, the enlisted men were intensely observant of their commanders. In the claustrophobic confines of a military base, secrets are incredibly difficult to maintain. Whispers began to circulate among the barracks. Soldiers noticed the strange assignments, the favoritism shown to certain young men, and the unusual private meetings. The tension within the regiment slowly began to build. Latham was no longer just risking his own reputation. He was steadily poisoning the morale and the operational integrity of the unit he was supposed to lead. His recklessness expanded beyond the gates of the military base. He began to involve local civilians in his network, blurring the lines between military jurisdiction and civilian law enforcement. He utilized local properties and leveraged his off-base privilege as to facilitate these meetings. By expanding the circle of participants to include individuals who were not bound by military discipline, he exponentially increased the risk of exposure. A soldier might be terrified into silence by the threat of a court-martial, but a local civilian had different loyalties and different fears. Latham's double life had reached a critical mass. He was balancing the massive responsibilities of an artillery officer during a national crisis with the desperate, constant maintenance of a sprawling, illegal sexual network. He was playing a high-stakes game of manipulation against the rigid machinery of the British state. Every encounter was a gamble. Every payoff was a potential vulnerability. And every order he gave was compromised by his hidden reality. The fortress he had built around his public identity was fundamentally unstable, hollowed out from the inside by his own actions. It only required one mistake, one observant military policeman, or one disgruntled civilian to bring the entire structure crashing down. And as the summer of 1941 approached, the margins for error finally vanished. The inevitable rupture of Paul Latham's dual existence did not begin with a grand political conspiracy or an orchestrated sting operation from high-ranking enemies. It began, as these cases almost always did in the mid-20th century, with the mundane machinery of wartime policing. By the summer of 1941, the sheer scale of his illicit network had outgrown his ability to control it. He had become arrogant, insulated by the belief that his aristocratic bloodline and his officer's uniform made him invisible to the law. He had expanded his circle of exploitation to include both military personnel and local civilians in the Sussex area, creating a complex web of encounters that relied entirely on the enforced silence of deeply intimidated men. But secrecy requires discipline, and Latham's escalating recklessness finally drew the attention of the authority. The local civil constabulary in Sussex had been dealing with the heavy influx of military personnel since the outbreak of the war. Their primary duties involved enforcing blackout regulations, managing rationing compliance, and keeping the peace between restless soldiers and the civilian population. However, they were also tasked with enforcing the rigid moral laws of the era. Rumors of unusual civilian and military fraternization in secluded areas began to filter through the local community. These were not direct accusations against a baronet, but vague reports of suspicious behavior involving soldiers and local men in the dark. In wartime Britain, any irregularity near a military installation was treated with severe suspicion, often initially feared to be espionage before being recognized as a moral offense. The coordination between the local police and the Royal Military Police, known as the Red Caps, tightened. They began to monitor the areas surrounding the camps of the 71st Searchlight Regiment more closely. They were looking for enlisted men breaking curfew or engaging in petty theft, completely unaware that they were about to ensnare a sitting Conservative member of Parliament. The trap was not set specifically for Sir Paul Latham. He simply walked into a routine surveillance operation fueled by his own lack of caution. When the authorities finally moved in, the reality of the apprehension was entirely devoid of the dignity Latham had cultivated his entire life. There was no polite knock on the door of Herstmonceux Castle. His network collapsed when military and civilian authorities intercepted evidence of his activities, leading to his direct apprehension. In a single devastating moment, the aristocratic shield shattered. He was no longer the commanding officer of the Royal Artillery or the respected MP for Scarborough and Whitby. He was a criminal suspect, caught violating the most heavily stigmatized laws of the British Empire. The immediate aftermath of the arrest was defined by a profound, paralyzing shock on all sides. For the arresting officers, the routine apprehension of men engaged in homosexual acts quickly turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. As they processed the suspects and demanded identification, the civilian police and military authorities realized exactly who they had in custody. The realization that they had arrested a baronet and a prominent political figure sent immediate shock waves up the chain of command. This was not a matter that could be handled by a local magistrate. The arresting officers found themselves holding a political explosive that possessed the potential to damage the national government. For Latham, the psychological impact of the arrest was absolute and immediate. He was intimately familiar with the law and understood exactly what was about to happen to him. The Criminal Law Amendment Act was unforgiving. He knew the legal process would be merciless, but the legal penalties, the prospect of 2 years of hard labor, were only a fraction of what he faced. The true terror lay in the total social and political annihilation that awaited him. He possessed a deeply ingrained understanding of how the British establishment operated. He knew that the very institutions that had protected him his entire life, the Conservative Party, the military command, The aristocratic social circles would instantly abandon him to protect themselves. The hours following his apprehension were spent in a state of profound desperation. He was detained, stripped of his authority, and forced to wait as frantic telephone calls were made between local police stations, military headquarters, and government offices in London. The War Office and the highest levels of the civilian government were alerted to the situation. The initial reaction among the political and military elite was a mixture of deep disgust and sheer panic. Winston Churchill's coalition government was navigating the most perilous phase of the war. The Soviet Union had just been invaded by Germany, and the entire focus of the British state was on maintaining absolute national unity. A scandal involving an aristocratic MP exploiting the troops under his command was the exact type of narrative the government feared most. It had the potential to ignite class resentment across the country and severely damage the public's trust in the officer class. During his detention, Latham was left completely isolated with his thoughts. He knew that, under standard procedure, the charges of gross indecency would be filed in a civilian court. This meant a public trial. The press, despite the heavy wartime censorship regarding military matters, would have a legal right to report on a criminal trial involving a member of parliament. He could vividly imagine the headlines. He could see his family name dragged through the mud, his wife publicly humiliated, and his political legacy reduced to a sordid punchline. The establishment he had served would ensure he was made a public example of, a sacrificial lamb, to prove that the law applied equally to the rich and the poor, even if the reality of the justice system was entirely different. The power he had wielded over the enlisted men just hours earlier had vanished completely. The gunners and privates who had been intimidated into silence were now potential witnesses for the prosecution. The very system he had abused to satisfy his desires was now mobilizing to crush him. He was trapped. There was no political maneuver, no amount of wealth, and no aristocratic connection that could buy his way out of a charge where he had been caught in the literal act by multiple witnesses. The sheer finality of his ruin settled over him. It was in this claustrophobic state of detention, facing the absolute certainty of public disgrace and the destruction of everything he had built, that Latham's mind fractured. He could not face the humiliation of the courtroom. He could not endure the sight of his peers oaking down upon him from the benches of the House of Commons. The prospect of standing in the dock stripped of his title and his dignity, while the details of his secret life were read out to the public, was a fate worse than physical death. He made a cold, calculated decision. If the establishment was going to destroy him, he would take the matter into his own hands. He would permanently silence the only man who could answer for these crimes. He would ensure that there would be no trial, no public spectacle, and no final humiliation. Following the initial shock of the apprehension, the bureaucratic machinery of the British military justice system lumbered into motion, but it moved with an awkward, deferential hesitation entirely unique to dealing with the upper class. Sir Paul Latham was not immediately thrown into a damp civilian holding cell to await his fate alongside common criminals. Because he held the King's Commission, military protocol superseded immediate civilian incarceration. He was suspended from his duties, relieved of his command of the 71st Searchlight Regiment, and placed under what was effectively open arrest. He was ordered to return to his quarters, restricted in his movements, and told to await the formal convening of a military inquiry. This period of waiting was designed to allow the authorities to compile the summary of evidence, gather witness statements, and decide formally on the venue and nature of the charges. For a man in Latham's position, this mandated isolation was a form of psychological torture far more agonizing than any physical confinement. He was sent back into the quiet, suffocating luxury of his private existence, left entirely alone with the catastrophic ruin of his life. The sprawling corridors of his estate no longer represented his power. They had become the walls of a gilded tomb. The silence of his quarters was deafening, broken only by the relentless, intrusive thoughts of the impending public spectacle. Latham was an intelligent man who thoroughly understood the mechanics of the British press and the political establishment. He knew that the moment the formal charges were filed and a trial date was set in a civilian court, the wartime censorship apparatus might not hold. Even if the government tried to suppress it, the sheer magnitude of a baronet and sitting member of parliament facing trial for gross indecency with working-class soldiers would inevitably leak. He visualized the reporters swarming the courthouse, the sketch artist capturing his humiliation in the dock, and the endless glaring headlines. He saw his wife's family, the descendants of the Duke of Wellington, forced to answer questions about his illicit network. He envisioned his fellow conservative MPs, the men he had dined with and debated alongside, publicly denouncing him to save their own political skins. The establishment would demand a sacrifice to prove their own moral purity, and he was the designated victim. Faced with this absolute, inescapable reality, the human instinct for survival inverted itself. Survival in Latham's mind equated to endless suffering, public degradation, and a historical legacy defined entirely by scandal. Death, however, offered an immediate, silent exit. It presented the only remaining avenue to exert control over his own narrative. If he died before the trial, the charges would have to be dropped. The scandal might still be whispered about in private clubs, but without a trial, there would be no public record, no sworn testimonies from the young gunners he had exploited, and no official conviction. He could be buried quietly, a casualty of the stresses of war, leaving his family with a tragedy rather than a permanent stain of criminal disgrace. He made the decision with a cold, terrifying clarity. He did not opt for a quiet overdose or a discreet firearm, methods often chosen by disgraced officers trying to save their regiments the embarrassment of a mess. He chose violence. He chose speed. Latham possessed a high-powered motorcycle, a machine built for velocity and mechanical aggression. In the early hours, well before the camp stirred or the military police assigned to monitor him could intervene, he prepared for his final ride. The physical act of starting the engine, the smell of the petrol, the vibration of the machine, these were the last sensory experiences of a man determined to erase himself from existence. He pulled out onto the narrow, winding country roads of Sussex. The English countryside, usually a symbol of the idyllic heritage he represented, was dark and indifferent. He opened the throttle. He pushed the motorcycle far beyond safe operating speeds, the engine screaming as he accelerated through the gears. The wind battered against him, tearing away the complicated, suffocating layers of his public life. In those final seconds, speeding down the road, there was no Conservative Party, no Royal Artillery, no Hurstmonceux Castle, and no impending trial. There was only the singular, overwhelming objective of kinetic destruction. He identified his target, a massive, immovable tree standing solidly near the edge of the road. He did not brake. He did not swerve. He locked his grip on the handlebars, braced his body, and drove the machine directly into the solid wood at maximum velocity. The impact was a catastrophic release of energy. The physics of the crash were brutal and unforgiving. The motorcycle disintegrated upon contact, metal twisting and snapping under the immense force. Latham was thrown forward, his body absorbing the devastating kinetic shock. The silence of the Sussex morning was shattered by the sound of crushing metal, breaking glass, and snapping bone. Then, absolute stillness returned to the road. Latham had calculated the speed and the angle perfectly to ensure his own demise. He had intended for the crash to snap his neck or crush his skull instantly. But the human body is a stubbornly resilient organism, and fate is rarely cooperative with the plans of desperate men. Sir Paul Latham did not die. When he was discovered by a passing patrol or local civilians, the scene was horrific. He was lying in the wreckage, barely clinging to life, surrounded by the mechanical debris of his failed execution. His body was fundamentally broken. The lower half of his physique had taken the brunt of the collision. He was bleeding profusely, unconscious, and fading rapidly. The emergency response was chaotic. He was rushed to a military hospital, the very system he had tried to escape, now mobilizing to keep him alive. The military surgeons assessing him in the trauma ward were confronted with massive catastrophic injuries. The most severe damage was to his leg, which had been crushed beyond any hope of surgical reconstruction. The bones were splintered, the tissue destroyed, and the blood loss was critical. To save the life of the baronet, the surgeons had only one option. They prepped the operating theater, administered the anesthetic, and amputated his leg. When Latham finally regained consciousness, the reality he woke up to was infinitely worse than the one he had tried to leave behind. He opened his eyes to the stark, sterile ceiling of a military hospital ward. The thick fog of morphine clouded his mind, but as the physical sensation slowly registered, the phantom pain in his missing limb delivered the crushing truth. He reached down and felt the empty space beneath the heavily bandaged stump. He had failed. The ultimate, desperate gamble had not paid off. He had not escaped the trial. He had not saved his family from disgrace, and he had not silenced the narrative. Instead, he had mutilated himself. He was now a physically broken man, lying in a hospital bed under military guard, still facing the exact same criminal charges that had driven him to the tree. He was trapped in a shattered body, forced to wait for the British establishment to decide what to do with him next. While Latham lay agonizing in his hospital bed, the telephones in London were ringing with frantic intensity. The news of his arrest had already caused panic. The news of his violent, failed suicide attempt elevated the crisis to a matter of state security. Inside the War Office and the private chambers of the Conservative Party leadership, the situation was assessed with absolute, ruthless pragmatism. The government realized that they were sitting on a public relations powder keg. If Latham had simply died in the crash, they could have managed the fallout. A brief, dignified obituary in the Times, a quiet funeral, and the police files could be permanently sealed in the name of national security. But because he lived, the problem remained entirely unresolved. The prospect of a civilian trial was now more terrifying than ever. A healthy, arrogant aristocrat standing in the dock for exploiting soldiers was a scandal. But a crippled amputee baronet being wheeled into the Old Bailey to face a jury regarding sordid sexual details was an absolute media circus waiting to happen. The public would be confronted with a grotesque narrative of aristocratic depravity ending in self-mutilation. The defense might try to use his injuries to garner sympathy, while the prosecution would be forced to drag the young enlisted soldiers into the open court to testify against a man who had already lost his leg. The entire spectacle would degrade the military, disgust the public, and severely damage the government's carefully maintained wartime morale. The inner circle of the establishment came to a swift, unified decision. The civil justice system, with its public galleries and press access, could not be trusted with this case. The rule of law had to be bypassed to protect the reputation of the empire. They needed a mechanism that allowed them to prosecute the man, punish the offense, and, most importantly, completely seal the records from the public eye. The solution lay in the strict, secretive architecture, EF military law. Even though the charges involved civilian men and violations of civil statutes, the government used its wartime emergency powers to assert total military jurisdiction over the matter. They decided that Sir Paul Latham would not face a judge and jury. Instead, he would face a general court-martial. It was a calculated, cynical maneuver. A court-martial could be held behind closed doors. The public could be barred. The press could be silenced through the Defense of the Realm Act, and the witnesses could be strictly controlled by military discipline. The British elite prepared to convene a secret tribunal for one of their own. They were not doing this to protect Paul Latham. He was already a ghost to them, a liability that needed to be surgically excised from the body politic. They were doing this to protect the myth of their own supremacy. As Latham lay in his hospital bed, wrestling with the agony of his amputation and the failure of his suicide, the machinery of a secret trial was quietly constructed around him. He was about to become the first sitting member of Parliament in over a century to face a military court, and the establishment was determined to ensure that not a single word of it would ever reach the British people. The physical space where the British Empire finally dismantled Sir Paul Latham was not a grand courtroom paneled in dark oak, nor was it the historic, imposing expanse of the Old Bailey. It was a sterile, brightly lit room within a military hospital, smelling sharply of iodine, carbolic soap, and the distinct underlying metallic scent of blood. This was where the General Court-Martial was convened in the late summer of 1941. The British establishment, terrified of a public spectacle, brought the machinery of justice directly to the bedside of the broken baronet. The contrast between the man who had commanded the 71st Searchlight Regiment and the man who now faced the military tribunal was absolute. Latham lay in a hospital bed, his body ravaged by the impact of the motorcycle crash. He was heavily medicated to manage the excruciating pain radiating from the freshly amputated stump of his leg. He was pale, physically diminished, and stripped entirely of the aristocratic aura that had protected him his entire life. Around him stood a panel of high-ranking military officers, men of his own social class, dressed in immaculate uniforms, looking down at him not with the customary respect afforded to a peer, but with a cold, unified disgust. They were not there to ascertain the truth. The truth was already documented in the police reports. They were there to perform a surgical strike on a political liability. The legal mechanics deployed to facilitate this secret trial were a master class in institutional self-preservation. Under normal circumstances, the crimes Latham was accused of, gross indecency and the exploitation of civilians, fell squarely under the jurisdiction of the civil courts. However, the government invoked strict wartime emergency powers to assert that because Latham was a commissioned officer and because his actions had compromised military personnel, the military justice system had absolute primacy. While perfectly legal under the Army Act for an officer facing moral charges, the establishment utilized this jurisdiction to ensure absolute secrecy. By keeping the trial within the military structure, the government effectively locked the doors to the outside world. This decision bypassed the fundamental democratic principle of open justice. A civilian trial would have required a jury of everyday citizens, public galleries, and press access. The court-martial required none of these. The proceedings were classified. The public was entirely barred from attending, and the specifics of the charges were heavily guarded secrets. The establishment argued internally that this secrecy was vital for national security and the maintenance of wartime morale. They reasoned that exposing the depravity of a commanding officer would hand a massive propaganda victory to the German intelligence services. While this was technically true, the primary motivation was far more parochial. The British ruling class was protecting its own institutional legitimacy. They could not allow the working class men and women fighting the war to see the rot at the very top of the command structure. While the military handled the witnesses, the civilian government neutralized the press. The British media during the Second World War operated under a system of heavy censorship, primarily managed through the issuance of D-notices. These were official requests to newspaper editors not to publish information on specific subjects for reasons of national security. When the news of Latham's arrest and subsequent suicide attempt began to quietly circulate through the rumor mills of Fleet Street, the government acted with brutal efficiency. Strict directives were issued to the major national and regional newspapers. The editors were informed that any reporting on the nature of Sir Paul Latham's injuries, the reasons behind his removal from command, or the existence of the court-martial was strictly prohibited. The compliance of the press was absolute. The British media establishment, which was largely intertwined with the political elite, understood the unwritten rules of class solidarity. They recognized that tearing down a conservative MP and military officer during the height of the Blitz served no one's interests but the enemy's. Consequently, the newspapers published nothing but brief, sanitized notices stating that Sir Paul Latham had been involved in a traffic accident and was recovering from his injuries. The sprawling network of exploitation, the violent crash, and the secret trial were completely erased from the public record. Inside the hospital room, the court-martial proceeded with a swift administrative lethality. Latham, heavily medicated and lacking the physical strength to mount any substantial defense, offered little resistance. The evidence against him, the police reports, the witness statements, the circumstances of his arrest, was overwhelming and irrefutable. His aristocratic connections, the wealth of his family, and his political status were entirely useless in this environment. The panel of officers did not deliberate for long. The verdict was a foregone conclusion the moment the tribunal was convened. Sir Paul Latham was found guilty on multiple counts of conduct unbecoming an officer and offenses against the Army Act relating to his illicit sexual network. The sentencing was designed to strip him of every vestige of authority and dignity he possessed. He was formally dismissed from His Majesty's service with ignominy, the most severe and humiliating discharge an officer could receive. He was stripped of his rank, his uniform, and his military standing. The military had officially severed the infected limb from its body, but the military conviction was only the first step in his total disenfranchisement. He was still technically a sitting member of Parliament. Under British constitutional law, a member of Parliament cannot simply resign their seat. They must be appointed to an office of profit under the Crown, which automatically disqualifies them from serving in the House of Commons. As Latham lay in his hospital bed, a convicted criminal awaiting transfer to a civilian prison, he was forced to participate in this archaic parliamentary theater. He applied for and was granted the position of steward of the Manor of Northstead, a purely nominal office used exclusively as a legal loophole to allow an MP to resign. The resignation was processed quietly, a brief administrative note in the parliamentary record. His constituents in Scarborough and Whitby were informed that their representative had stepped down due to ill health following his motorcycle accident. The Conservative Party quickly moved to fill the vacancy, distancing themselves from him with ruthless speed. Within a matter of days, Latham had lost his military command and his political career. The final component of the establishment's judgment was physical incarceration. Despite his severe injuries and his status as a recent amputee, Latham was not granted a reprieve from his criminal sentence. The court-martial sentenced him to 2 years of imprisonment. Once he was deemed medically stable enough to be moved, the final transition of his ruin took place. He was transferred from the private, controlled environment of the military hospital into the cold, unforgiving reality of the civilian penal system. The gates of the prison closed behind him, sealing away the man who had once walked the halls of Herstmonceux Castle and the corridors of Westminster. The establishment had successfully neutralized the threat. They had punished the offender, silenced the victims, blinded the press, and protected the sacred image of the British elite during its most desperate hour. Sir Paul Latham was now just another inmate, a broken man in a cell, left to confront the absolute terrifying silence of his new existence. The cover-up was complete, flawlessly executed by a system that understood exactly how to bury its own dark history. The transition from the tightly controlled environment of the military hospital to the brutal, unyielding reality of the British civilian penal system marked the final phase of Paul Latham's institutional destruction. When the heavy iron doors of the prison closed behind him, they severed his last remaining tether to the world of privilege he had known since birth. He was no longer a patient under the care of deferential military surgeons, nor was he a subject of interest to high-ranking officers managing a political crisis. He was simply an inmate reduced to a number, processed through a system designed to strip away individual identity and enforce absolute compliance through physical and psychological deprivation. For a man accustomed to the sprawling expanse of Herstmonceux Castle, the spatial confinement of a 1940s British prison cell was a profound shock. The walls were close, damp, and indifferent. The environment was entirely devoid of the comforts and aesthetic beauty that had defined his existence. But the psychological shock of confinement was immediately overshadowed by the agonizing physical reality of his condition. Latham was a recent amputee, his body still traumatized by the violence of the motorcycle crash and the subsequent emergency surgery. The civilian prison system of the era was not equipped, nor was it inclined, to accommodate the disabled, especially those convicted of moral offenses. Navigating the daily routines of prison life, the rigid schedules, the crude sanitary facilities, the hard labor expectations, became a grueling, humiliating ordeal. Without the constant medical attention and pain management he had received in the hospital, he was left to manage the raw, aching phantom pains and the physical limitations of his severed limb in a harsh, unsympathetic environment. The physical pain served as a relentless anchor, grounding him every waking second in the reality of his failure. Every difficult step on crutches, every struggle to maintain basic personal hygiene in a cold cell was a physical manifestation of his spectacular fall from grace. His presence within the general prison population presented a unique and dangerous dynamic. In the intensely hierarchical world of a prison, inmates convicted of homosexual offenses were routinely relegated to the absolute bottom of the social order, subjected to abuse, isolation, and violence by other prisoners. Latham carried the added burden of his former class and rank. He was a wealthy aristocrat and an ex-officer thrust among the working-class criminals he had formerly helped to legislate against. To the other inmates, he was an object of derision, a fallen elite whose hypocrisy had been violently exposed. To the priez on guards, he was a disgraced figure who had betrayed the uniform and the country during wartime, warranting no sympathy and no special treatment. He was completely isolated, caught in a hostile vacuum where his previous authority meant absolutely nothing. As he endured the brutal monotony of his 2-year sentence, the outside world, the establishment he had once served, methodically began the process of excising him from its collective memory. The first, most intimate severing of ties came from his own family structure. The aristocratic alliance he had forged through his marriage was swiftly and cleanly broken. Divorce proceedings were initiated. The family of his wife, deeply embedded in the upper echelons of the British peerage, moved with calculated speed to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his conviction. The marriage had been a structural pillar of his public facade. With that facade destroyed, the contract was nullified. Upon his release in 1943, the aristocratic alliance he had forged through his marriage was formally broken when his wife initiated divorce proceedings. He was left entirely alone, stripped of his marital connections, while his former in-laws closed ranks to protect their own reputation from the collateral damage of his existence. Beyond the dissolution of his marriage, a broader societal amnesia was strictly enforced. In the private clubs of St. James's, in the dining rooms of the country estates, and in the corridors of the House of Commons, Sir Paul Latham ceased to exist. His former colleagues in the Conservative Party, the men who had relied on his wealth and his vote, simply stopped speaking his name. He became a non-person. The British upper class possessed a ruthless capacity for self-cleansing. When one of their own committed an unforgivable breach of the unwritten rules, not just by breaking the law, but by doing so in a way that threatened the structural integrity of the class system itself, the response was total ostracization. There was no room for public pity, no path for rehabilitation, and no acknowledgement of the underlying hypocrisy that allowed other, more discreet elites to continue their own double lives unchallenged. Latham had committed the ultimate sin. He had been caught, and he had made a mess. While Latham sat in his cell, wrestling with the physical agony of his amputation and the psychological weight of his total isolation, the Second World War raged on without him. The Royal Artillery regiments deployed to North Africa and the Mediterranean, fighting desperate, bloody campaigns. The political leaders in Westminster directed the survival of the empire, making decisions that shaped the global order. The society he was supposed to lead, the troops he was supposed to command, and the historical moment he was supposed to be a part of, all marched forward, leaving him entirely behind. He was forced to read about the war in the heavily censored newspapers, occasionally permitted in the prison, a passive, forgotten spectator to the defining conflict of his generation. The stark contrast between the monumental historical events occurring outside the prison walls and the miserable, confined reality of his cell reinforced the absolute totality of his failure. The days bled into months, and the months into years. The prison environment systematically broke down whatever remained of the arrogant, confident politician who had once believed his wealth made him untouchable. He was forced to confront the direct consequences of his actions without any of the insulating barriers of his former life. He had to live with the knowledge of the men he had exploited, the military structure he had compromised, and the violent, desperate attempt on his own life that had left him crippled. He was stripped down to the absolute core of his being, a man forced to survive in a hostile environment using only his own internal resilience, utterly devoid of the external power he had relied upon for the 36 years. When his 2-year sentence finally drew to a close in 1943, the release process was stark and unceremonious. There was no fanfare, no waiting carriage, and no eager reporters. The military had long since moved on. The government had successfully buried the scandal, and the press remained strictly bound by the wartime censorship directives. The heavy iron doors of the prison opened, and Paul Latham stepped out into a changed world. But he was not stepping into freedom. The physical imprisonment had ended, but the societal exile was permanent. He was walking out of a literal cell only to enter a much larger invisible prison constructed by the British establishment, a prison of complete obscurity, social banishment, and historical erasure. He was 43 years old, a disgraced amputee with a shattered reputation, facing a lifetime of shadows. Released in 1943, Latham stepped into a permanent, invisible exile. His marriage dissolved, his ancestral Hurst-Monceau castle was sold, and the establishment that once protected him systematically erased his name from their records. He died in absolute obscurity in 1955 at the age of 50. The true victims, the working-class soldiers structurally coerced into his network, were quietly scattered across European battlefields, their testimonies locked in classified files. Sir Paul Latham's erasure was the British elite's final operational victory, a flawless cover-up that buried an inconvenient truth, sacrificing the vulnerable men in the lower ranks to preserve the myth of aristocratic moral supremacy.